Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today's episode 118, August 19th, 2022. I had way too much fun putting this show together today. I don't know what's wrong with me, but send help, because we're actually talking about hearing aids today, of all things. But what's so cool about hearing aids today, or should I actually say 2 days ago, is the FDA just opened up their rulemaking. This has been on its way since 2017. But for all of you who are involved in innovation or clinical practice, or you've got a loved one who's suffering from hearing loss, and that's quite a few of us, as you'll hear today, or you're an investor wanting to know what new markets are opening up, this should be a really interesting show, because while this has been on its way since 2017, it was only 2 days ago that the rulemaking finally hit. It's going to be implemented October 17th of this year. And we'll be talking all about that today in today's show. But first, some local news. Save the date, September 20th. We're just about a month away from the MichBio Medical Device Summit, the Michigan Medical Device Summit in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We've been telling you about it for months. Looking forward to that being in person in Kalamazoo. And while we're talking about that, it just feels like so many things are opening up, so many events are happening. I feel like the community is coming out in force this fall. The number of conferences and other things that are coming back to in person, it's just amazing. We'll tell you about a couple other events that are happening here momentarily. Looks like we've got Windows doing its thing there, always fun. Fast Forward Medical Innovation, Research Commercialization 101, the basics of life science product development. They're running a cool two-part series Monday, August 22nd. That's next Monday from noon to 1. You can watch it over your lunch hour. Then Session 2, Value Proposition Design and Customer Discovery, next Wednesday, August 24th. Also over the lunch hour. You can watch that. Hope you enjoy those. You can register for those at the following link, innovation.medicine.umich.edu, Research Commercialization 101. Do a pause there, capture that, and go ahead and sign up and enjoy those over your lunch hour next week, Monday and Wednesday. Last week, we had Tricia and Stacy on talking about the Aspire program. We're going to show you those slides again here really briefly. Running out of Techtown, the Med Health program is working alongside Aspire, and Aspire has a 5-week program split between virtual and in-person in Detroit at Techtown. October 3rd through 31st is the virtual portion. November 3rd and 4th, the in-person portion. There's an August 22nd deadline, a lot happening next Monday. For companies that want to apply, you can go to venturewell.org/aspire, and that's how you can get into that program. If you want to talk to Tricia, she's at tcompas, TCOMPAS, at venturewell.org, and I'm sure she would still love to hear from you. We had another guest on last week, and that's our friend Jeff Reinvelt from Renaissance Venture Fund. And he told us about the Fall 2022 Undemo Day. He's going to be back on next week to tell us again about it. But for the moment, if you are interested in getting to be part of this, it's at Ford Field in Detroit on October 12th. They usually have up to 200 or over 200 investors doing in-person meetings for select companies. We talked with Jeff last week, and if you're at a point where you're ready to sell your company to investors, this isn't for somebody who says, "Oh, it would be fun to get VC," and "Hey, I'm gonna submit for this," right? This is somebody who understands what a pitch deck is. They understand what it means to actually sell a part of your equity for investment. But if you're ready to bring investors in and take not only the money, but also the feedback and the ownership percentage that comes with that, this could be a really cool opportunity. So we'll have Jeff back on next week to tell us more about it, but we're really looking forward to that on October 12th. And it's for companies that are raising in the next 3 to 18 months. So if you're planning to raise, like maybe you're not right in the middle of a raise, but you're just about to be, this would be a great event to come to. And as Jeff mentioned to us, Tech Week is happening. Michigan Tech Week is happening about that same time. So be sure to make that part of your plans as well. And next week, it's the last installment of our Women Who Innovate series, and not to be missed. Next week, we've got Jen Baird, the president and CEO of Fifth Eye, also a supporter of this show. We're thankful for her. And Elka Lipka, who is the president and CEO of TSRL. It's going to be a high-powered show next week. Join me in welcoming these two women on the 26th, August 26th. So we're looking forward to that. Well, that brings us to our main event today. And it's one, I tell you, I don't think I should have gotten this excited about it. But it's a really interesting topic. Because rarely do we get to see such a new market being created. Now, let me take that back for a minute. 2.5 years ago, as COVID was coming, with a lot of sadness, we knew that new markets would be created, new opportunities would be created, but they weren't happy ones. They weren't ones that we wished upon ourselves as a society. But this is one where so many people suffer from hearing loss, and there's so much room for innovation. And so this is kind of a fun one, because there's really a lot of new space to do things for people. You may suffer from hearing loss, somebody near you probably does. And now there's some cool opportunities coming along. We're going to tell you about it. None of this is medical or legal advice. I need to disclaim that. We are not hearing loss experts, nor are we talking about legalities. In fact, I'm going to mention how this came to be. And the only law part of this is actually how the Congress told FDA to go ahead and do this. But what we're going to be talking about today is all what is called rulemaking. It's the kind of stuff that FDA has authority to do. As you know, FDA doesn't make laws, but they do get to establish rules relative to laws that are already on the books. And that's what we're going to be talking all about today. FDA observed this, that there's a lack of clarity between PSAPs and hearing aids. And this has contributed to stakeholder and consumer confusion. Now, if you're confused by that, I think that's a great place to start, because what is a PSAP? I didn't know this term until very recently. And for that matter, what really is a hearing aid? What are these things? And if you've been a frequent watcher of this show, you probably know that the answer, as always, depends on the intended use of the device. You know I had to get that in there. Intended use drives everything about a medical device. It's really hard to answer the question of what do I have to do or what applies to me if you don't know what your device's intended use is. And so it doesn't really matter what a PSAP is. It doesn't really matter what a hearing aid is. It only matters what these stand for and how you market them to the consumer. And that's what we're going to be talking about in a little bit. But first, let's go all the way back. We're going to go way back in time, because I want to give you a short history of hearing aids. And I hope this is as interesting to you as it was to me to put together. I'm going to take you all the way back, first of all, to the 1500s, to a man by the name of Pedro Ponce de Leon. He was a monk in Spain who started working with those who are hard of hearing. And he's credited as being, quote, the first teacher for the deaf. One of the first people that in history we have recorded as caring about people who were deaf. It appears that Pedro developed a manual alphabet of a sort that was a precursor to what we might consider to be sign language today. It wasn't a full-fledged sign language. But apparently it was based on simple hand gestures that monks who were living in silence used to communicate. In other words, their lifestyle corresponded enough with the life of somebody who couldn't hear that they had these techniques at their disposal that they could use to start to communicate with those who were deaf. This was the thing that struck me the most about Pedro's work. On Wikipedia, they noted that Ponce de Leon's work with the deaf was considered bold by contemporaries, as the prevailing opinion among most Europeans in the 16th century was that the deaf were incapable of being educated. That's really sad. It's really sad for us today to read that, but exciting that somebody cared enough to try to better the condition of those living with hearing loss back in the 1500s, learning to communicate with them, helping them to speak, and going forward from there. You're going to see an echo of that in FDA's recognition of what the problem is. We'll get to that in just a minute. But how people tried to help those who are hard of hearing throughout the centuries will come next to the 17th century with the innovation of ear trumpets. I thought this was a really interesting step, which is really just a reverse horn. It's not that these devices amplify anything from a technological perspective, but like a telescope with a wide diameter on it, they take the available sound, in this case, that's available to them, just like a telescope does with the light coming through the front. And it's not so much that they amplify it as they concentrate it. They bring it all down to a single point. So all the sound that's coming in through a wider segment is brought down and focused on a small section right towards the eardrum. One of the most, I think, amazing and also kind of crazy innovations of the ear horn was actually King John VI of Portugal. And Washington University School of Medicine has this picture I want to give them credit for. It's this otherwise innocuous looking chair that has what almost looks like a stethoscope umbilical coming over the backside of the chair. Now this would go into King John's ear. And the only other strange part of this chair are these lion heads that are at the front of the armrests. Well, these were basically an ear horn. And so to use this, it really served two purposes. To use this, the visitor had to come up towards this somewhat of a throne, had to kneel down and speak directly into the lion's mouth so that King John could hear. Here's a little close-up of the lion's head and the earpiece that went into King John's ear. Now, I think this served two purposes. One was to help him hear, and also it tended to get the visitor lower and more deferential. So take that for what it's worth. But we see these innovations. There were chairs built throughout the centuries with basically ear horns built into them. And there were these hideable ear trumpets from the 1800s, where if you had longer hair or a headdress of some sort, these could go into your ear, much like a modern hearing aid, and they just increased the diameter of the available sound area, going right directed into your eardrum. So innovations like this, there's so many, myriad innovations over the years, but really cool stuff. But what really changed the landscape for hearing aids? Well, of course, it goes back to Alexander Graham Bell. He didn't invent the hearing aid at all. We're not giving him credit for that. But in 1876, he patented the telephone. It's a way to communicate sound from one place to another, electronic processing of sound. That set the stage for what would eventually become hearing aids, among other things. Here's a picture of Alexander Graham Bell in 1892, talking for the first time from New York to Chicago. Voice transmitted across the miles. And of course, if you can transmit it across the miles, you can transmit it across shorter distances too and process it in ways that would have been unthinkable before this. And this brings us to a person you've probably never heard of. His name is Miller Reese Hutchinson. He was born in 1876 and died in 1944. But his inventions are myriad. He's responsible for at least two generations of what we now think of as hearing aids. The first one was called the Acouphone, Akouphone. and then something called the Acousticon that came into somewhat more widespread use. These were devices that were worn on a belt, but had a microphone and had something that went to the ear. It's interesting also that Miller worked as chief engineer for Thomas Edison at his New Jersey laboratory. A funny tidbit that I came across is that Miller was also responsible for the invention of the klaxon. Now, I didn't know that klaxon was actually a patented device with a name associated with it. It was after some Greek word for shrieking. And apparently the klaxon was incredibly loud. It was used on naval vessels and was tried out on automobiles as a warning system. Somebody joked that Miller had invented the klaxon to create a market for his hearing aids. Now, we don't know if that's true, but it is sort of a funny anecdote from history. But if you've ever heard the term klaxon, that's actually where it comes back to. He made things that were incredibly loud. He also made some of the first hearing aids. And in the intervening years, we've gone all the way from vacuum tubes, incredible innovations, all the way through things like Bluetooth. The last time I saw somebody demonstrating their hearing aid technology for me, they were changing all the settings on their phone, able to change. It's almost like a mixing console right in front of them. It's really incredible technology. And oftentimes, and you've heard on this show, oftentimes, well, we can sometimes be a little bit complaining that the regulatory landscape doesn't change as quickly as it could. Oftentimes, FDA is lagging behind where other industries can be. And when we see the innovations in cell phones and related technologies, we say, why can't you keep up? Well, in this case, they're actually trying really hard to keep up. Here's what happened in 2017. The FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017, now this is a congressional thing, directs the FDA to establish a category of over-the-counter hearing aids through rulemaking, and mandates that FDA establish various requirements for this category of devices. So in other words, Congress said in 2017, FDA, you're going to do over-the-counter hearing aids. It's time for over-the-counter hearing aids. And if you've heard us talk about some of the constraints on the agency, that's actually a nice step for Congress to do, because now FDA doesn't have to go around asking, how are we going to do this? They've been mandated to do it, and they get to do it through the action of their rulemaking. Now, they're not just doing this blindly. FDA, in their rulemaking, actually spends quite a bit of time talking about the need within the market for those who have hearing difficulties. This right here is the proposed rulemaking issued 2 days ago on August 17th. It goes into effect on October 17th of this year. But in these 42 or so pages, FDA notes some interesting statistics. Like this one, 1 in 5. What does that mean? Well, 1 in 5 people who could benefit from hearing aid technology aren't getting the benefit of it. This can be because it's too expensive, you have to go see a doctor to get it. Also, sometimes it's because of the stigma associated with it. Oh, now I'm going to look like I'm old because I've got a hearing aid, or I'm going to see a doctor to get a hearing aid. What if these were available over the counter in your drugstore? Would more people use them? Would more people benefit from them? The NIH says that about 37.5 million American adults aged 18 and over have some trouble hearing. So this, if you're an investor and you're thinking about what kind of market does this create, we're looking at 37.5 million adults who deal with hearing loss. Would the usage be higher if it's available over the counter? That's the expectation. There's that 37.5 million number. Something like only 1 in 5 of those are actually getting helped through the hearing aid market. And it's interesting because FDA notes this, that the use of hearing aids has been linked to, among other health benefits, reductions in the incidence or severity of cognitive decline, depression, and other health problems in older adults. That's not my idea. I'm not a clinician. I don't know these things, but FDA is saying, hey, look, if we help people hear, they can stay engaged in society better and longer. I thought it was cool because it's like our friend Pedro started to discover so many years ago, 500 years ago. People who can communicate, they can be part of society. We don't get to think of them as, well, you're outdated or you never had the faculties to communicate with the rest of society. And FDA is citing that same kind of a mentality. Hey, we can keep people engaged. We can help them be productive members of society just by helping them to hear better. I think that's really cool. Here's the rulemaking online. You can find it online. Here is the regulatory requirements. This is the guidance. So the guidance comes into official effect when the rulemaking goes into official effect. The date for that, one more time, effective date October 17th of this year. So this is coming up really, really fast. If it wasn't on your radar and you're interested in hearing technologies, I actually had a colleague who is a listener of the show write me and say, you know, my daughter is in audiology and she's working in this area. This is going to be really cool for her. We're hoping that she gets a chance to listen to this show and also to learn more about the technology, hopefully to create some really cool new technology that wouldn't have been allowable from a regulatory perspective even just earlier this year. Here's some things we're going to skip today when we're talking about this rulemaking. This is, first of all, I'm going to say it's not a deep, deep dive. There's no way to cover all 48 of these pages in complete detail in the next 20 minutes here. But we're also not going to cover state provisions. Within the rulemaking, they note that states sometimes have their own regulatory requirements when it comes to hearing aids. Now, that's not something I knew before going in depth into this. We're not going to cover those, but just know that you're not just up against federal things when it comes to hearing aids, apparently. There are state regulations. And again, we're not going to cover every last detail of this. So if you're interested, go ahead and pull your phone out, scan this. It'll take you to the FDA website. That's a really big, like every FDA URL, it's a very big 2D barcode to get you there. But go ahead and check that out if you'd like to read in more detail this document and the guidelines, the guidances that are available for you on that. Well, earlier on we started here. The intended use of a hearing aid. It's any wearable device designed for, offered for the purpose of, or represented as aiding persons with or compensating for impaired hearing. Well, and you say to yourself, well, anything could do that, right? I've seen all sorts of devices that could do that. I've got earmuffs that have a microphone built into them to cut out outside noise. Isn't that a hearing aid? Well, pay real close attention. Designed for, offered for, or represented as aiding persons with or compensating for impaired hearing. If you're just going out there working in a noisy environment, we hope that your hearing isn't impaired. A device that helps you hear things better when you're walking in the woods but damps down the sound of a loud noise, it's not compensating for impaired hearing. It's just helping you hear better. Now, before we get to that funny acronym we brought out earlier, what about this? Cochlear implants or other implantable devices. Are those included under the definition of hearing aid? And the answer is a resounding no. Those are not included under the definition of hearing aid. Those are often class 3 devices. They often require pre-market approval. They're implantable. These are not in view today at all, either under the existing regulations or under the new ones. So if you're interested in cochlear implant technology, today's discussion is not for you. We're talking about hearing aids, sound amplification devices in general. Now, like over-the-counter drugs, and this language is from FDA, over-the-counter medical devices typically have the following characteristics. They can be used outside of healthcare settings. They're adequately labeled such that the consumer can self-diagnose their condition, self-select the device, and understand how to use the device. Here it is, without a healthcare provider. We're going to focus in on this in just a minute because this is really important. If you've never thought about it before, and I hadn't before we got into this show, there are actually real distinct problems that can emerge if you start shoving amplified sound into your ears with the potential for health conditions that are associated with it. So we'll talk about that in a second. But in general, an over-the-counter device has to have low potential for reasonably foreseeable misuse, and the safety margin has to be such that the benefits of having an available over-the-counter device outweigh the risks of it. Well, here's something you may or may not have seen, but I think they're awfully cool. Now, we're not endorsing them, but these taken from the website of walkergameear.com. Again, never used them, not endorsing them. But there's incredible technology out there for amplifying hearing. You want to go out for a walk in nature, you don't want to hear loud sounds, but you do want to boost the birds and the animals and everything else. Many companies out there are selling products like this. They are called PSAPs, personal sound amplification products. I don't know if anyone other than FDA is using that term, but that's what these are being used for. They're to boost low sounds and to cut high sounds. They're to protect your hearing. You don't have any hearing loss, you don't have any hearing problems, you don't have any disease, and they're not marketed to solve any of those problems. They're just there to help you hear the birds and the animals better. FDA says this: unlike hearing aids, which are intended to aid a person or compensate for hearing impairment, PSAPs are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease, and are not intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Therefore, they are not considered to be medical devices. So, what are the risks? Because you know that FDA thinks about things in terms of risk and managing risk, and does the benefit outweigh the risk? And you've heard us talk about this so many times on the show. What about a PSAP? What's the risk of a PSAP? How bad could it get? Well, the risk of amplified hearing is fundamentally sound overexposure. That's really it. Now, consumer product and electronic safety stuff applies to these products, but that's really the risk that needs to be mitigated for these non-devices. What about hearing aids? And you've probably never thought about this, but I was very intrigued when I started to think about the kinds of risks associated with hearing aids. Here's the big one that I hadn't thought about. Undiagnosed issues going untreated. If you just start shoving more sound into your ear because you think it might help because you're having trouble hearing, it might help in the short term, but maybe there's actually a different issue. Maybe there's impacted wax in the ear. Worse yet, maybe there's some underlying disease state that you don't know about and you should really be seeing your doctor for. Now again, this isn't medical advice and it's not legal advice, just educational. We're just regurgitating what FDA has said here. But I personally found that really interesting, that if I'm having trouble hearing at some point in my life and I think to myself, wow, I just need a hearing aid, well, think what we're hearing from FDA is there's actually a lot of other reasons that hearing can go bad. Yes, sometimes it's I blew my eardrums out. Yes, sometimes it's I'm getting old, but that's not the only reason. And there are risks associated with these other reasons that we have to be cognizant of if we're going to market hearing aids. Also, sound overexposure. Yes, we can overexpose people to sound when we're making hearing aids, just like PSAPs. Now, these items that we need to be on the lookout for, if we were marketing a prescription-only device, our clinician would be looking for them. Our clinician would be saying, hey there, I think you really better think about this issue. We've got to look for this disease state before we give you a hearing aid. Now that is going to be communicated for over-the-counter hearing aids. That's going to be communicated through labeling. And as you've heard us say on the show before, labeling is not the best way to communicate things in the world of medical devices. But nevertheless, there are red flags that FDA is putting front and center and saying, if you're going to sell an over-the-counter hearing aid, you need to warn people about these red flag situations. Here they are. Birth defect, unusual shape, injury, or deformation. Hey user, if you have a birth defect of your ear, an unusual shape to your ear, some injury or deformation to your ear, go see a doctor. Don't use this over-the-counter device. If you've had blood, pus, or fluid coming out of your ear in the last 6 months, hey user, don't use this over-the-counter hearing aid. If you're having ear pain or discomfort, that could be an indication of some bigger problem, so don't use this over-the-counter hearing aid. Are you having lots of earwax or something that may be in your ear that you suspect? That is not a time to go out and buy an over-the-counter hearing aid. It's a time to go see your doctor. Are you having vertigo? That can be an indication of something in your ear. Go see a doctor. Don't buy an over-the-counter hearing aid. Are you having sudden hearing changes or hearing changes where one ear is worse than the other? See the doctor. Don't buy the hearing aid. Or a ringing or buzzing in only one ear. These are the things that FDA is trying to elevate as red flags in prominent labeling on a package, so that if you walk into the store and you go, hey, I can buy an over-the-counter hearing aid, you're warned and said, hey, there are reasons you'd want to go see your doctor. So yeah, this is your right and your freedom to go buy this, and we're going to let you do it, but hold on, here's the places that you might be in danger and not know about it. Also, interestingly enough, there's an over 18 requirement. And this took me by surprise. Why not open it up to everybody? Why not make hearing aids for everybody? And in this regard, FDA had some interesting things to say. Over 18, hearing loss is sadly kind of expected. As we grow older, we're exposed to loud sounds. Frequently, our hearing does go bad. But if you're in a pediatric population, it can be from congenital malformations. It can be from infections. It can be from genetic causes, or even types of poisoning. There are lots of horrible reasons that you can have hearing loss as a younger person. If you had good hearing as a younger person and you're growing up and your hearing is going bad, this is the market that FDA is allowing us to target now. But if you're under 18 and you've got bad hearing, it's not normally supposed to be that way. It's often an indicator of some other underlying problem. And this is what FDA is trying to draw attention to. That's why they're not allowing over-the-counter hearing aids for those under 18. It's only over. Now, they're also asking for some safety things. We said that there are really two big risk categories. One is other diseases that you could have that you're not paying attention to. But the other is just overexposure to sound. And so there's going to be a 115 decibel limit. And so if you get exposed to 115 peak decibels, you can sustain it for just a little bit without hearing loss, but you've got time now to get that thing out of your ear or in some other way compensate for it. They're going to push that up to 120 decibels if the device has a user adjustable volume control, because you have a way to get that sound down even below those levels if you'd like to. So they're going to have those. Now, it goes beyond what we're going to cover today to cover all the different types of hearing aids that are out there, the legacy types, the types that will now be eligible for over-the-counter. There are at least 5 types on the books right now. Again, this does not include things like cochlear implants and other implants like we talked earlier, but there's at least 5 types. These are generally air conduction. The sound is conducting through the air through amplification. But we're not going to go real deep. It's sufficient to say today hearing aids can be Class 1 and exempt from the 510K process. They can be Class 2, subject to the 510K process, as well as special controls, particular for the category. Or Class 2 with special controls, but exempt from the 510K process. So there are some cool options in there. There's lots of space to navigate depending on what you may be thinking about innovating. Okay, but what about those people, and they're always in the audience, who say, well, I didn't actually want to sell a medical device in the first place. I wanted to sell hearing augmentation. I'm innovating on hearing augmentation. My market is the sports or loud noises industry. Well, what if I want to sell a PSAP? Well, for you, we created this really helpful section, how to get in trouble with the FDA. So if you're looking how to get in trouble with the FDA, stay tuned for the next 4 slides, because that's what we love to tell people. This is how you can shoot yourself in the foot if you're trying not to create a medical device. Okay, flip that on its head. I know you don't want to get in trouble with the FDA. The first one, and these are directly from the FDA in their guidance that we're talking about today. If you suggest that the product is for users with certain types or severity of hearing loss or impaired hearing, you're not a PSAP. You're not a personal sound amplification product. You're a hearing aid. Because you're saying we treat a specific disease state or condition. And that's not what you want to be saying, because it puts you smack dab in the definition of what is a medical device. Don't suggest that the product is indicated for use in situations that are typically associated with and indicative of hearing loss or impaired hearing. Have you lost your hearing because of your participation in motorsports? Not only can this device protect your hearing, it can augment the lost hearing that you lost over the last 30 years. Sounds catchy, but that would be what they're talking about here. Don't say we can help you in this kind of a situation because you've lost your hearing in it. Don't suggest that it's an alternative or a substitute for a hearing aid. For example, this is a less expensive alternative to a hearing aid. This will get you through until you can afford a hearing aid. That would be a no-no. Or telling the user how to optimize the use of the product to mitigate their hearing loss. Again, it's diagnosis and treatment of a disease state or condition. It's not just hearing augmentation. Now, that's not to say you probably couldn't market a device to augment hearing and a person who has hearing loss could buy it. The point here is that we are not going to specifically tailor our language or our indications towards people with hearing loss, telling them how they can improve upon it. It's those people that FDA wants to make sure either a doctor is seeing them to help them diagnose their actual condition, or to warn them strenuously, hey, if you're using this to treat, there could be other problems that you may not have thought about. I know this is probably TMI, but I've experienced having wax in my ears. Some of you may have as well. And you know that you can hear less and less and less when that happens. I think what they're saying is the last thing we want to be doing is jamming more sound in, when really what we have there is just a physical block to not be able to hear it, as well as other examples that we gave earlier. Well, here are some things you should expect. Now, this is for the developers of hearing aid devices over the counter. This is just a brief overview of a couple points that I know you're going to have to address. There's a lot more inside these 42 pages. If you ever want to crack it open, use the 2D barcode from earlier to go to the FDA website. feel free to talk to us here at Into Being. But electroacoustic performance limits per this ANSI standard, they want distortion control limits. And actually, since we do have just a minute here, I want to tell you just a bit about some of these areas that we weren't necessarily going to put into the slides, if we can find them here. You've got distortion control limits, self-generated noise limits, latency limits, frequency response bandwidth, and frequency response smoothness. And this is interesting because FDA says distortion control has to do with how faithfully the device reproduces frequencies. So it's a question of how high fidelity is the sound. And if you've ever encountered somebody with an older hearing aid, you know that that was a problem historically. Self-generated noise limits can obscure or overwhelm softer output sounds and might distract or annoy users. So we don't want this thing squealing or making other untoward sounds. There has to be a way to limit that. Latency limits. And this could be a safety issue, right? If a sound comes in but takes too long to come to the user, best case, you're going to get echo that distracts the user and it makes it hard for them to, if you've ever been on a Zoom call where somebody's microphone is inappropriately open and echoing, you'd have that kind of an effect. It's almost impossible to talk over that. But worst case, if they need to receive the information in through their ears and it's taking time to get there, it could delay their response to stimulus. Frequency response bandwidth and frequency response smoothness, again, things that are ensure that daily speech or environmental sounds are heard in a way that works. So I think it's interesting that they're getting into these details. These are things that are going to be required. Now, that's not required if you want to sell a PSAP. You don't have to reproduce sounds accurately. You don't have to reproduce sounds well. There can be other noises. Now, I don't think most people are putting that into their product intentionally, but FDA is putting very specific requirements for these things into their product requirements. Also there are physical requirements. We won't belabor these details. But FDA talks about things like maximum insertion depth. Don't shove the thing too deep. Don't make it scratch as it goes into the ear canal. Proper physical fit. How are you going to ensure that? Will there be tools, tests, or software for control and customization? All these things need to be thought about. There are more details in the proposed rulemaking that goes effective October 17th, as well as labeling requirements. There's more than you can shake a stick at in here in terms of labeling, as you can expect. There's even example labeling in the back. We took the red flags out here in this, but there's example labeling telling you symptoms that would indicate you have mild to moderate hearing loss. There's a warning. It sure looks, I don't know if we can actually see this on the screen, but it reminds me nothing so much of the tobacco warning on cigarette packages, I guess, that went in back in the 80s or 90s. Warning, if you were younger than 18, do not use this. You should go to a doctor because your condition needs specialized evaluation and management, and you're not allowed to use it if you're under 18. So they have a lot of these examples in here. They're very interesting. I was surprised to find how much social consideration the FDA was giving in this document. It really did shock me a little bit how much they're thinking of it very, very holistically. So it is cool. And immediately pre-COVID, we were always giving the FDA credit that they were thinking more holistically and they were being more reasonable. And COVID has made life hard, very much so, for many of us and for the FDA. But this is a pretty cool rulemaking, and so hopefully for some of you it opens up the possibilities. Whether you're suffering from hearing loss, guess what? CVS, Walgreens, wherever your favorite drugstore, in the future there will be the possibility of buying these devices over the counter. And if you're in the innovation space, wow, really, really cool. Some of the things you were wishing that you could do, suddenly are going to become possible. Now, there are limitations, there are warnings, subject to all the usual gotchas. But we just thought this was a really cool thing to bring to your attention here on MedTech Crossroads, that this is actually a sea change in what FDA is making possible when it comes to over-the-counter hearing health devices. Again, effective date is October 17th of 2020, but certainly not too early to begin thinking about this. That's the end of our presentation today. We've got a few minutes before the top of the hour, and before I remind you about what's happening next week, we'll take just a moment here for questions in case anyone has any questions or comments. Maybe you've got somebody who suffers from hearing loss and you're interested to know more, or you're interested in the innovation aspects and you'd like to talk about how that could impact what is possible in the near future. We'd be happy to hear from you. Feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom room, or to put it into the chat there. Those are both options for you. And we'll give it just a minute in case anyone has any questions or comments. But yeah, boy, I hope that more stuff like this happens in the future, because so often we're sitting there saying, FDA, you could do something about this, you could do something about this. If you walk into a CVS or a Walgreens in the coming years and you see hearing aids on the shelf, 2 days ago is when that happened. 2 days ago is when that changed. And it's really, really cool. Let me remind you of this. Next week, the Women Who Innovate series, August 26th. Jen Baird, President and CEO of Fifth Eye, with us. Elka Lipka, President and CEO of TSRL. It's going to be a wonderful show. We are looking forward to it, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for being with us on MedTech Crossroads.